There exists a profound and persistent illusion that haunts the human mind, a silent distortion in the architecture of our perception. It is not the lie that deceives us most effectively, but rather the truth poorly proportioned, reality distorted by the intensity of its own voice. What screams loudest in our ears is not necessarily what occurs most frequently in the world. What shines most brightly in our memory is not necessarily what possesses the greatest statistical significance. And yet, our brain, that magnificent and flawed organ, treats ease of recall as synonymous with probability, confuses the vividness of remembrance with the frequency of occurrence. Tonight, we examine one of the most insidious cognitive traps governing our financial decisions, the availability heuristic. It is the bias that causes us to dramatically overestimate the probability of events simply because they are easily remembered, because they are recent, because they are emotionally charged, because they capture our imagination with their sharp claws. It is the psychological mechanism by which a single widely publicized plane crash makes us fear flying more than driving, even though statistically, we are infinitely safer in the sky. It is the reason why yesterday's headline shapes our view of tomorrow with far more force than decades of carefully compiled data. In the shadowy theater of finance, this bias becomes particularly treacherous. It transforms rational investors into crowd followers. It converts carefully constructed portfolios into emotional bets. And most dangerously, it grants disproportionate power to those who control not the truth, but the volume at which truth is proclaimed. To understand this phenomenon in all its psychological depth, we must first witness its manifestation in the form of a fable. There was, in times that seem simultaneously distant and frighteningly present, a merchant village situated at the confluence of ancient roads. The village prospered through trade, and its inhabitants had developed over generations a particular wisdom about when to buy, when to sell, when to stock, and when to distribute. This wisdom was not written on stone tablets nor proclaimed in public squares. It existed as an underground current of knowledge, transmitted in quiet conversations between experienced merchants, recorded in dusty ledgers that documented decades of transactions, embodied in the cautious gestures of elders who had survived countless seasons of abundance and scarcity. At the center of this village was a square where merchants gathered at dawn to make collective decisions about their businesses. And it was in this square that there appeared, one foggy morning, a figure who would forever change the community's destiny. He called himself simply the Herald, and he carried with him a polished bronze drum that captured and amplified each beat with a resonance that seemed to penetrate not just the ears, but the very bones of those who heard it. The Herald possessed no more information than any other village inhabitant. He had no access to secret sources of knowledge. He had not studied weather patterns more carefully, nor analyzed trade routes more diligently. His only distinctive ability was the capacity to speak louder, to present each fragment of information with a dramatic urgency that made hearts race and reason falter. When he beat his drum and proclaimed news, any news, it reverberated through the square with such intensity that all other voices seemed to disappear in comparison. The Herald's first proclamation was about an exceptionally abundant harvest in a distant region. He did not invent this information, it was true. But the manner in which he presented it, beating his drum with growing fervor, describing mountains of golden grain under impossibly blue skies, made it seem that the abundance was not just real, but imminent, not just significant, but transformative. The village merchants, hearing this vibrant proclamation, immediately revised their expectations. If there was so much abundance there, surely prices would fall. They hastily sold their own stocks at reduced prices, anticipating an imminent collapse in grain value. But the distant harvest, though real, was only one among hundreds. Its impact on the general market would be marginal, absorbed by the vast trade network connecting dozens of regions. The village ledgers, had anyone stopped to consult them, would show that exceptional harvests occurred regularly somewhere, and that they rarely affected local prices dramatically. The elders murmured their concerns, but their voices were low, measured, devoid of the electrifying urgency of the bronze drum. And low voices, however wise, cannot compete with the clamor of proclaimed certainty. Here lies the first fundamental principle of the availability heuristic. The ease with which we can retrieve information from our memory is unconsciously interpreted as an indicator of its frequency or importance. The Herald did not need to provide more information, only more memorable information. The dramatic proclamation created a psychological availability that completely distorted rational probability assessment. The merchants were not asking, "How often do exceptional harvests actually affect our prices?" They were simply reacting to the vividness of the image the Herald had painted in their minds. Weeks passed, and the distant abundant harvest had exactly the modest effect that historical data would have predicted. Almost none. Prices fluctuated within their normal ranges. But the merchants who had sold in panic now watched with dismay as others, who had held their stocks, profited from steady demand. The lesson should have been clear. And yet, when the Herald appeared again, this time proclaiming a devastating storm that had supposedly destroyed crops in another distant region, the same merchants gathered around him again, their faces turned upward, their hearts racing, their reason temporarily suspended by the pure power of vivid narrative. This time, the reaction was opposite, but equally irrational. Anticipating scarcity, the merchants bought frantically, artificially raising prices in their own village long before any real scarcity could materialize. They paid exorbitant sums for stocks, only to discover, weeks later, that the storm, though real, had affected a region whose production was insignificant in the context of general trade. Once again, the ledgers would have shown that storms, floods, and plagues were regular events in a vast trading system, and that they rarely caused the catastrophes their dramatic representation suggested. The phenomenon intensified. With each Herald proclamation, more merchants abandoned their traditional practices of consulting historical records, of seeking the measured counsel of elders, of calculating probabilities based on decades of experience. Why? Because the bronze drum was easier to hear, because the dramatic voice was easier to remember, because the emotional urgency of the latest news was more psychologically available than the accumulated wisdom of generations. This is the second principle of the availability heuristic. Recent events dominate past events in our perception of probability. Our mind is not an impartial statistical calculator. It is a narrative machine that gives disproportionate weight to the most recently loaded stories in its memory. The merchant who had heard about the storm that morning dramatically overestimated the probability of scarcity, not because he had analyzed new data, but simply because the information was fresh, vivid, emotionally charged. The village entered a vicious cycle of self-imposed volatility. Prices oscillated wildly, not in response to real changes in supply and demand, but in response to the Herald's proclamations. Merchants began positioning themselves not based on their own judgments about economic reality, but based on their predictions about what the Herald would say next and how others would react. The market became a game of crowd psychology, where success depended not on understanding the world, but on understanding the distortion through which the world was being perceived. Some merchants grew wealthy in this new environment, but they were not those with the best understanding of agriculture, climate, or trade. They were those who had learned to anticipate the Herald's proclamations, to position themselves moments before he'd beat his drum, to profit from the predictable reactions of the crowd. They were not wiser, they were simply faster at exploiting collective madness, and their wealth, in the eyes of others, seemed to validate the importance of listening to the heralds with even more attention. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the square, the elders continued maintaining their records. Their ledgers showed a clear pattern. Volatility had increased dramatically since the herald's arrival, but the underlying reality of trade had remained remarkably stable. Abundant harvests and destructive storms had always occurred with approximately constant frequency. What had changed was not the world, but the perception of the world. What had changed was not the actual probability of events, but the psychological availability of certain types of events in collective consciousness. One of the elders, a man whose family had traded in the village for 5 generations, finally attempted to intervene. He brought his ledgers to the square one morning, hoping to demonstrate through meticulous data that the herald's proclamations, though always based on real events, were profoundly misleading in their implication of significance. He showed that in any given year, there were dozens of exceptional harvests and dozens of destructive storms in different regions. He demonstrated that price volatility in the village had increased dramatically, while actual production volatility had remained constant. He argued with the calm of decades of experience that they were reacting not to reality, but to a dramatically biased sampling of reality. But his voice was low, His data was complex. His presentation lacked the emotional urgency that had become the only language the crowd still understood. And at that exact moment, while the elder was still speaking, the herald appeared on the other side of the square, beat his drum 3 times, and proclaimed news of a gold discovery in distant lands. The crowd turned as a single entity, drawn by the shining promise of sudden wealth, and the elder found himself speaking to an empty square, his pages of carefully compiled data fluttering uselessly in the morning breeze. This is the third and perhaps most cruel principle of the availability heuristic. Emotionally charged information supersedes statistically rigorous information in our decision-making process. It is not that the merchants were stupid or ignorant. It is that the evolutionary architecture of the human mind is designed to respond more intensely to vivid threats and dramatic opportunities than to abstract probabilities and statistical trends. Our ancestors who heard warning cries about a nearby predator and reacted immediately survived. Those who stopped to calculate the statistical frequency of predator attacks in that specific area were eaten. The availability heuristic is an evolutionary adaptation that served us well in small-scale environments and immediate threats, but that betrays us spectacularly in the modern world of complex markets and statistical risks. Months turned into years, and the village that had once prospered through accumulated wisdom became a place of chronic anxiety and erratic prosperity. Fortunes were made and lost with dizzying speed, not through skill or labor, but through the luck of being on the right side of the latest proclamation. The community became addicted to the bronze drum, unable to function without the false certainty it provided. They had traded the uncomfortable ambiguity of reality for the comforting illusion of certain knowledge, without realizing that what seemed like certainties were merely highly available events in their memories. And the Herald? He never lied, not once. Each of his proclamations was based on real events. His genius, if we can call it that, lay not in fabricating information, but in selecting which information to proclaim and how to proclaim it. He had intuitively understood what modern psychologists would spend centuries formalizing, that human beings do not process information like statistical computers, but like storytellers who give disproportionate weight to the most vivid and recent narratives. The Herald's final fate remains ambiguous in our fable, as it should be. Perhaps he is still there, beating his drum in the square, his voice as loud as ever. Or perhaps he departed for another village, to repeat the same process, to discover again that there is always an eager audience for certainties proclaimed loudly, always a crowd willing to trade silent wisdom for dramatic urgency. But the merchant's fate is clearer. Those who learn to consult the ledgers, to seek long-term patterns, to distrust dramatic proclamations regardless of their volume, eventually recovered some stability. They never grew wealthy as rapidly as the lucky speculators, but they also never fell as precipitously. They understood that in the great marketplace of existence, true probability rarely announces itself with a bronze drum. Now, let me bring this fable out of the realm of metaphor and directly into your world, into the concrete universe of financial decisions you face every day. Because the Herald is not a figure from the mythical past. He is the sensationalist headline you read this morning, the news alert that makes your phone vibrate, the television segment that transforms complex economic data into dramatic narratives of catastrophe or opportunity. When a plane crashes, airline stocks plummet, not because the statistical probability of accidents has changed significantly, but because the event is now vividly available in public consciousness. When a terrorist attack occurs, investments in certain sectors or regions are avoided, even when rational analysis shows that the probability of another attack remains statistically insignificant. When a specific stock gains prominence for a dramatic price increase, retail investors buy it en masse, overestimating the probability that exceptional performance will continue, precisely because the success was so dramatically available in their minds. This is why you sell in panic at the bottom of a bear market, not because fundamental analysis has changed, but because the news of losses is so intensely available, so emotionally charged, that your brain unconsciously interprets this availability as evidence that losses will continue indefinitely. This is why you buy at the top of a bull market, when euphoria is most intense and success stories are most vividly remembered. Your brain confuses the ease of recalling recent gains with the probability of future gains. The financial industry understands the availability heuristic better than you might imagine, and exploits it systematically. Why do you think investment funds so prominently advertise their best recent performances? Why do portfolio managers appear on news programs to discuss their winning bets, but rarely their losses? Why does financial media obsessively focus on hot stocks and dramatic market movements? Because they know that making information more available in your mind will make you overestimate its importance, its probability of repeating, its relevance to your own decisions. The statistical truth about investing is often boring, silent, devoid of drama. Markets tend to rise slowly over decades. Diversification reduces risk in mathematically predictable ways. Low-cost investments consistently outperform active trading strategies over long periods. But these truths cannot compete with the dramatic story of the stock that increased 1,000% in 1 year, or the investor who perfectly predicted a market collapse. These vivid narratives become disproportionately available in our collective consciousness, completely distorting our perception of what is probable versus what is merely memorable. The central lesson is not simply that you should distrust dramatic news, though that is a good practice. The deeper lesson is that you must recognize and actively compensate for your own brain's tendency to confuse ease of recall with frequency of occurrence. When you find yourself making a financial decision based on something you recently read, something that caused a strong emotional reaction, something everyone seems to be talking about, pause. Ask yourself, am I reacting to actual statistical probability, or am I reacting to the psychological availability of this information? Develop your own personal ledger. Keep records of your thoughts about investments and the reasons behind them. Over time, you will discover an embarrassing pattern. Your strongest convictions, those that seemed most certain at the moment, were often based on information that was simply more available, not more accurate. You will see that you sold in fear when negative news was most intense, and bought in euphoria when positive news was most vivid, and that in both cases, you would have done better doing exactly the opposite. Actively seek information that contradicts dramatic narratives. When everyone is proclaiming a new golden age for a technology or sector, force yourself to read skeptical analyses. When panic dominates and everyone predicts catastrophe, force yourself to examine historical data on market recoveries. Not because contrary voices are necessarily correct, but because they make alternative perspectives available that your brain would not naturally seek on its own. And above all, recognize that the bronze drum will always be beating. Modern media, with its insatiable need for attention and engagement, will ensure there is always a new dramatic proclamation, a new crisis or opportunity being sold with maximum urgency. Your brain, with its evolutionary predispositions, will always respond to these proclamations more intensely than they deserve. Wisdom does not lie in silencing the drum. It lies in recognizing the sound for what it is, a call not to truth, but merely to attention. In the end, the availability heuristic teaches us an uncomfortable truth about the human condition. We are compulsive storytellers living in a statistical world, emotional navigators trying to chart courses through oceans of data. Financial success belongs not to those who never feel the pull of vivid narratives, for that would be to deny our own humanity. It belongs to those who feel the pull, recognize it for what it is, and make their decisions based not on what shines brightest in their memory, but on what the evidence quietly suggests to be true. The next time you hear the bronze drum, and you will hear it because it never stops sounding, remember this fable. Remember the merchants who abandoned decades of wisdom for moments of dramatic urgency. And then, calmly, deliberately, consult your own ledgers, examine the actual probabilities, and make your decisions not based on the volume of the proclamation, but on the substance of the evidence. If these reflections on the hidden traps of the financial mind resonated with you, if you wish to continue exploring the psychological truths that govern our relationship with money, risk, and decision, subscribe to this channel, because there are more fables to be told, more biases to be exposed, more illusions to be unveiled, and the journey toward financial wisdom begins not with the accumulation of tips and tricks, but with deep understanding of why we think as we think, decide as we decide, and fail as we fail. The drum is always beating. The question is, are you still listening?